Engine grease tastes like burnt copper and regret. I was spitting it into a stained shop rag when the kid showed up at my bay doors. Not a human kid. He had skin the color of bruised plums and eyes like fractured quartz. He didn't ask for spare credits or scrap. He just slid a heavy, cold-forged signet ring across my workbench, looked me dead in my tired eyes, and said, "My mother needs a husband. I want a father. Marry her and help us fix this broken galaxy." Sweat dripped from my nose, cutting a clean line through the soot on my cheek, before landing with a quiet hiss on the cooling manifold of a rusted freighter. My joints ached. They always ached lately. Spaceport gravity simulators were notoriously cheap, constantly fluctuating between 1.2 Gs and a gut-churning 0.8. It grinds the cartilage down to dust over the years. I wiped my hands on my coveralls, leaving thick black streaks across the faded fabric. "Beat it, kid," I said. My voice sounded like coarse sandpaper dragging across a rusted hull. I don't buy stolen jewelry, and I sure as hell don't do charity. The boy didn't flinch. He stood about chest-high, rigid as a steel girder, his breathing shallow and rapid. The air in the hangar was thick, smelling of ozone, cheap, synthesized recyc oxygen, and the sour tang of my own stale sweat. But he didn't seem bothered. He just kept staring at me with those fractured quartz eyes. "I am not seeking charity," he said. His voice was piped through a subdermal translator chip, flattening out the alien clicks of his native tongue into a crisp, perfectly enunciated, standard English. He had chosen the name Toby for his registry file, a weirdly quaint Western name for an alien whose species ruled 3 separate star systems. "I am seeking a human. You are Dean. You served as a logistics coordinator in the border campaigns. You have a reputation for being." Unbothered by protocol, I snorted, picking up a heavy hydro spanner and tossing it into my toolbox. It landed with a heavy, satisfying clang. Unbothered by protocol is a polite way of saying I got court-martialed for telling an admiral to shove a plasma torch up his exhaust port. It doesn't make me marriage material. Now take your ring and go. "My mother is Diana." My hand stopped halfway to the toolbox. The name sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my exhausted nervous system. Diana wasn't just a name. It was the translated moniker of the high prime of the core worlds. She was the architect of the fragile peace treaty, holding 70 species back from mutually assured destruction. She was also notoriously dangerously alone at the top. "Right," I muttered, turning to face him fully. I leaned against the workbench. The metal was cold against my back, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the hangar. "Let's pretend I believe you're the high primes, kid." "Why me?" "You have billions of aristocrats, generals, and politicians who would kill literally to share her bed and her throne." "Exactly," Toby said. The translator couldn't hide the sudden raw tremor in his chest. A subtle shifting of the plum-colored scales around his neck betrayed his anxiety. "They will kill. They are sycophants, assassins, and bureaucrats. My mother is drowning. Her council feeds her lies. Her generals wait for her to show weakness. She does not need a politician. She needs a blunt instrument. She needs a human." I looked down at the ring resting on my grease-stained bench. It was heavy wrought from pale iridium, bearing the crest of the High Council. It wasn't a fake. The ambient light caught the intricate engravings, casting tiny, sharp shadows. "You want me to step into a galactic crossfire?" I said, rubbing the bridge of my nose. My fingers smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid. "You want a grease monkey to marry the most powerful woman in the quadrant, play stepdad to an alien prince, and intimidate her enemies by refusing to use the right salad fork." Humans possess a psychological resilience to intimidation that borders on neurological defect. Toby stated, reciting it like a textbook definition. But his hands, three-fingered and clawed, were trembling. He clasped them together to hide it. You are stubborn. You break rules to achieve functionality. My mother's empire is a machine that is seizing up. You fix machines. I stared at him. He was just a kid, a terrified kid, watching his mother get eaten alive by a political machine desperate enough to walk into the slums of a deep space repair station to find a monster scary enough to guard her. I charge 50 credits an hour for labor, I said, my voice dropping lower. Toby blinked, the inner nictitating membrane sliding sideways across his eyes. The royal treasury is vast. You will have access to billions. I don't want billions, I snapped, surprising myself with the sudden surge of anger. I want quiet. I want a hot shower that doesn't smell like sulfur. And I want to know your mother actually agreed to this insane plan before I get vaporized by her royal guard. She did not agree, Toby admitted, his voice barely a whisper. She does not know I am here. I let out a long, ragged exhale. The sheer absurdity of it sat heavy in my chest. I should have thrown him out. I should have tossed the ring back and locked my blast doors. But I looked at his trembling hands, remembered the agonizing, hollow feeling of being utterly alone in a crowded room, and grabbed a clean rag from the dispenser. All right, Toby, I said, scrubbing the worst of the grease from my palms. The rag felt rough against my calluses. Take me to your mother. But if she orders my execution, I'm billing your allowance for my funeral. The elevator ride to the spire was a study in sensory whiplash. Down in the hangars, the air was thick, wet, and loud. Up here, it was sterile. The atmosphere scrubbers pumped in air so pure it practically burned the back of my throat. It smelled of ozone and white lotus, a manufactured scent meant to evoke calm. It just made my teeth ache. The silence was absolute, save for the high-frequency hum of magnetic repulsors pushing us higher into the artificial atmosphere of the capital station. I felt violently out of place. My coveralls were stained. My boots left faint scuff marks on the immaculate, brushed steel flooring, and my knuckles were permanently bruised. Next to me, Toby stood perfectly still, radiating a nervous energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. When those doors open, Toby whispered, staring straight ahead at the polished metal of the elevator doors, the guards will raise their weapons. Do not make sudden movements. Good tip, I muttered, crossing my arms to keep my hands from shaking. Usually I like to sprint screaming at heavily armed royal guards, so I'll try to curb the habit. The boy didn't laugh. The doors hissed open with a soft, pneumatic sigh. The room beyond was massive, vaulted like a cathedral, and bathed in harsh, cold light filtering through floor-to-ceiling transparasteel windows. Below us, the entire sprawl of the capital city turned slowly against the backdrop of the cosmos, and there was Diana. She stood at the far end of a long obsidian table, flanked by 4 towering Praetorians in ceremonial but highly functional armor. Even from 50 feet away, I could feel the crushing weight of her exhaustion. Her scales were a paler shade of plum than Toby's almost silver in the harsh light. She wore robes of deep crimson, but they hung off her frame as if she had shrunk inside them. She was arguing with a hologram of a bloated, multi-limbed senator, her voice sharp and brittle. "The trade routes through the Perseus arm will remain open, Minister," she said, resting her palms heavily on the table. "If you blockade the medical shipments again, I will not send diplomats. I will send dreadnoughts. You do not have the council votes for a military action, High Prime." The hologram sneered, its voice dripping with oily confidence. "You are overreaching. The hologram flickered and died as Diana slammed her fist onto a control panel. She slumped forward for a fraction of a second, her shoulders curling inward, before she caught herself and straightened her spine. It was a deeply human gesture of defeat. Then she looked up and saw us. Her eyes widened, the quartz-like irises flashing with sudden panic. The 4 Praetorians instantly leveled their plasma rifles at my chest. The humming of their charging coils was deafening in the quiet room. "Toby," she breathed, ignoring me entirely. "What is this? Get behind me." "Mother," Toby said. He didn't move toward her. He stood his ground, his small frame rigid. "I have brought him. The human." Diana's gaze finally shifted to me. I could see the immediate calculation in her eyes, followed by a wave of profound confusion, and then intense irritation. She took in my grease-stained clothes, the heavy boots, the complete lack of diplomatic posture. "A human," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. She waved a hand, and the guards lowered their rifles a fraction of an inch, though they didn't safe the coils. "Toby, we discussed this. The human integration program is a long-term diplomatic goal, not a pet adoption." I couldn't help it. A short, ugly laugh barked out of my throat. "Trust me, Your Highness, the feeling is entirely mutual. I'm not here for a leash." Diana's eyes narrowed. "Then why are you standing in my secure command center, tracking engine sludge onto a floor older than your species' spaceflight? Because your kid came into my shop, handed me your royal signet ring, and asked me to marry you," I said flatly. I held up the iridium ring. The light caught the crest. Diana froze. The air in the room seemed to shatter. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the guards' weapons. A dark, bruised flush spread across her neck and cheeks, the alien equivalent of a blush, though it looked more like a hemorrhage. "You gave him the seal," she whispered, her voice cracking. She looked at Toby, the mask of the High Prime, slipping completely to reveal a terrified, utterly overwhelmed mother. "Toby, do you understand what you've done? That seal grants him proxy authority over the First Fleet." "You are dying, Mother," Toby said. The translator couldn't hide the tears in his voice, even if his alien eyes didn't shed them. "They are poisoning your food. They are blocking your fleets, and you do not sleep. You need someone who does not care about their politics. You need a monster." He pointed a trembling, clawed finger at me. "He yelled at an admiral and was exiled. He repairs broken things. Let him repair this." Diana looked at me, utterly shattered. I expected her to order me arrested. I expected her to scream. Instead, she just looked at my grease-stained hands. "Do you have any idea how complicated galactic trade law is, human?" she asked softly, bitterly. "No," I said, stepping forward. The guards tensed, but I ignored them. I walked up to the obsidian table and dropped the heavy ring onto its surface. It clattered loudly. "But I know what a seizing engine looks like. You've got too much friction in the system, Your Highness. Everyone's trying to grind the gears to a halt so they can pick the scraps when the machine blows apart." I looked her in the eyes. Up close, I could smell the bitter scent of her stress pheromones masking the white lotus. She was trembling. "I don't know politics," I told her, my voice low, "but I know how to break the fingers of the people throwing wrenches into your engine. Your kid paid me in advance. You want me to leave, say the word. You want me to stay and help you clean house. You're gonna have to let me do it my way." Diana stared at me, the silence stretching out until it felt like a physical weight. She looked at the ring, then at Toby, and finally back at me. "What is your name, human?" "Dean." She let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "Gods help me, Dean. I hope you brought a very large wrench." Sonic showers are a crime against the nervous system. Instead of hot water washing away the day's grime, high-frequency sound waves vibrate the dirt, dead skin, and grease right off your body. It leaves you feeling raw, your teeth buzzing in your skull for an hour afterward. I stood in the center of the blindingly white circular wash chamber in the royal guest wing, letting the hum rattle the fatigue deep in my bones. When the cycle ended, the silence in the room was heavy enough to suffocate in. I stepped out and grabbed the clothes a silent insectoid servant had left on the pristine counter. They were dark charcoal grey and woven from a synthetic silk that felt too light, almost liquid against my skin. The trousers fit perfectly, and the tunic had a high, structured collar that screamed aristocracy. I hated it immediately. It felt like a shroud. I dug through my canvas duffel bag, bypassed the soft slippers they had provided, and pulled on my own steel-toed work boots. They were scuffed to hell, the leather cracked and stained with Starship coolant, but lacing them up grounded me. When I finally walked into Diana's private study, the contrast between us was painfully sharp. The room was vast, lined with physical books, a ridiculous flex of wealth in an age of data slates, and smelled of dry parchment and something sharp like crushed mint. Diana was standing by a massive window, looking out at the city's glittering sprawl. She had shed the heavy crimson ceremonial robes. She wore a simple pale wrap, her posture stripped of the rigid perfection she held in the command center. She was holding a heavy crystal glass, filled with a viscous amber liquid. I thought humans preferred their sleep cycles to align with planetary rotations, she said, not turning around. Her voice was flat, stripped of the translator's usual diplomatic inflection. I spent 6 years working night cycles on orbital dry docks, I said, leaning against the heavy oak frame of the doorway. My circadian rhythm is permanently shot. What are you drinking? She turned slowly. Up close, without the harsh lighting of the war room, the exhaustion around her eyes was brutal. The scales beneath her lower lids were bruised a deep, mottled black. She held out the glass. It is distilled from the sap of a Corvallian iron tree. It burns the throat but quiets the mind. I walked over my heavy boots, thudding against the woven rugs, and took the glass. I took a sip. It tasted like turpentine mixed with burnt cinnamon. It hit my stomach like a lit flare. I coughed, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. Smooth, Diana let out a short, breathy sound. A laugh, maybe, or a sigh. She walked over to a low, sprawling sofa and practically collapsed onto it, pulling her knees up. In that moment, she didn't look like the High Prime. She looked like a woman who was drowning in an ocean of paper cuts. "Toby is asleep," she said softly, staring at the empty glass in my hand. "He has not slept through the night in 4 months. Not since his father's transport was destroyed." I set the glass down on a side table. Accident. A micrometeoroid strike on a shielded royal cruiser. She looked up at me, her quartz eyes flashing with sudden cold anger. No, it was a message, and now they are waiting for me to break. The Minister of Trade, the fleet admirals, the provincial governors. They smile, they bow, and they slowly cut my supply lines. They are trying to force me to abdicate before the solstice. I sat down in an armchair opposite her. The upholstery was too soft. I had to brace my boots on the floor just to feel anchored. "So you let a mechanic with a bad attitude marry you. That's going to fix the supply chain. It buys me the one thing I do not have," Diana said, leaning forward. "Unpredictability. The Council has modeled every one of my psychological profiles. They know exactly how I will react to a tariff, a border skirmish, or a diplomatic slight. They play me like a stringed instrument." She stared right at me, studying the scars on my forearms, the grease permanently embedded under my fingernails. But humans, your species is an anomaly. You are not the strongest or the smartest, or the oldest, but you are utterly, terrifyingly stubborn. You thrive in chaos. We're basically galactic cockroaches, I muttered. You survive, she corrected. And right now, I need to survive. If we register the marriage bond tomorrow, the archaic laws of the Prime Council dictate that my spouse is granted immediate, unquestionable authority over the royal estate and its security forces. It is a loophole they never closed, because no High Prime has ever married outside the nobility. Let me get this straight, I said, rubbing the back of my neck. The skin there was still vibrating from the shower. You want me to take control of your Praetorians and start executing people? No. Diana said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The scent of mint and stress pheromones spiked in the air between us. I want you to make them afraid. I want you to walk into the council chamber tomorrow and remind them that the High Prime is no longer playing by their rules. I need a guard dog, Dean, and Toby just needs someone who isn't looking at him like a piece on a chessboard. I looked at her. Really looked at her. I saw the slight tremor in her hands, the way she kept her jaw clenched to stop her teeth from chattering. She was holding the fate of 70 systems on her shoulders, and she was doing it completely alone. I leaned back, resting my arms on the soft armrests. I thought about the grease monkey life I was leaving behind, the quiet, pathetic safety of my hangar. Then I thought about the kid standing in my shop, terrified, but refusing to show it. All right, I said, my voice rough. We play it your way. But I need a datapad, unfiltered access to your supply manifests, and a very strong pot of whatever passes for coffee on this station. If I'm going to bite these bastards, I need to know exactly where their throats are. Diana let out a long, shuddering breath, her shoulders dropping 3 inches. I will have the files sent to your room. Get some sleep, Diana, I said, standing up. Tomorrow the cockroaches go to war. The doors to the High Council chamber were forged from a dark, porous stone that seemed to swallow the light. They stood 50 feet high, heavy enough to crush a tank. When they ground open, the sheer volume of noise spilling out felt like a physical blow. It was a cacophony of 100 different species, trilling, clicking deep, sub-vocal hums, and the sharp, reedy tones of alien aristocrats bickering over imaginary borders. The air smelled of ozone, heavy floral perfumes meant to mask biological odors, and the sharp, coppery tang of adrenaline. I stood in the antechamber, pulling at the stiff collar of my ceremonial tunic. I had drawn the line at the heavy cape they tried to pin on me, settling instead for a dark, tailored jacket over my black shirt. My steel-toed boots clacked loudly against the marble floor. Diana stood beside me, radiant and terrifying. The bruised exhaustion of last night was gone, buried under layers of shimmering silver powder and the rigid, unyielding posture of a monarch. Her crimson robes trailed behind her like a river of blood. They are already debating the Perseus trade route, she murmured, her lips barely moving. Minister Vaughan will speak first. He will attempt to table the discussion until next cycle, starving the border colonies for another month. Vaughan, I repeated. The bloated guy with the extra arms, yes. Do not let him dictate the pace of the room. Got it. I cracked my knuckles. The sound was flat and dry in the massive hallway. Presenting the High Prime Diana and her consort-elect Dean of Earth. A herald bellowed his voice, amplified by the chamber's acoustics. The silence that followed was instantaneous and absolute. As we walked through the massive stone doors, hundreds of eyes, compound reptilian mammalian, snapped to us. I could feel the collective shock radiating from the tiered seating that circled the central floor. The shock wasn't for Diana. It was for the primate walking a half step behind her, looking like he'd rather be stripping an engine block. We reached the central podium. Diana took her seat on the high carved throne. I didn't sit. There was a smaller, ornate chair beside hers, clearly meant for me, but I ignored it. I stood beside her right arm, my hands resting on my belt. My weight shifted comfortably into my heavy boots. Down on the floor, Minister Vaughan rose from his podium. He was a massive slug-like creature, draped in ostentatious gold silks, supported by a grav sled. His 4 upper appendages twitched with barely concealed irritation. High Prime. Vaughan's voice oozed through the translation matrix, oily and condescending. The council is surprised. We were not informed of an impending union, much less one with a human. He spat the word like a bad taste. Perhaps this matter should be investigated by the Bureau of Lineage before we proceed with the day's vital commerce. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. They were trying to stall, trying to put me in a box labeled bureaucratic delay so they could get back to bleeding Diana dry. I didn't look at Diana. I didn't wait for permission. I stepped off the raised dais and walked down the shallow steps toward the central floor. The murmurs died instantly. The 4 Praetorian guards flanking the room tensed their hands, dropping to their weapons, but Diana raised a single sharp finger. They froze. I walked right up to Vaughan's podium. The smell of him was overwhelming, like rotting fruit and expensive cologne. He had to look down at me, his multiple eyes blinking in rapid, agitated sequence. "You're Minister Vaughan," I said. I didn't yell. I kept my voice low, conversational, forcing the chamber's audio pickups to strain to catch my words. It made everyone lean in. "I am the Minister of Trade, human," Vaughan sneered, "and you are out of order. This floor is for council members. I was reading your supply manifests last night." I interrupted, leaning my forearms on the edge of his pristine, glass-topped podium. I intentionally let the metal rivets of my jacket scratch the surface. Vaughan flinched. "Fascinating reading. You've claimed a 12% loss of bulk agricultural fertilizer to pirate raids in the Perseus sector over the last 3 cycles. Vaughan's throat sac expanded. "The Outer Rim is lawless. The pirates are bold. Yeah, I flew logistics in the Outer Rim for 6 years. I said, my voice hardening. I tapped a grease-stained finger against the glass. "Pirates don't steal fertilizer, Vaughan. It's heavy low yield and impossible to fence on the black market. You know what they steal, palladium. Fission batteries. Weapon tech." The chamber was dead silent. The air felt brittle, like it was about to snap. So I ran some math. I continued staring directly into his primary eyes. "The exact chemical breakdown of the fertilizer you're shipping happens to be perfectly suited for refining ammonium perchlorate precursors. The exact same precursors the separatist factions in the neighboring system are using to build high-yield breach charges." Vaughan's golden silks suddenly seemed too tight. His lower appendages gripped the edges of his grev sled. "This is an outrage. You are accusing a minister of the High Council of treason based on the uneducated ramblings of a mechanic." "I'm not accusing you of anything, Vaughan," I said, pushing off the podium and standing straight. "I'm telling you that starting tomorrow the Royal Fleet is taking over the Perseus trade route. Your private contractors are fired. Any ship attempting to move unregistered cargo through that sector will be boarded. If they resist, they will be turned into floating scrap." "You do not have the authority," Vaughan shrieked, looking past me to Diana. "High Prime, call off this feral beast. The Council must vote on military deployment." Diana leaned forward in her throne, her silver-dusted face an unreadable mask of absolute authority. "Under the Concordat of the First Era," she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls, The consort-elect commands the royal security forces. His authority is my authority. His decrees are absolute. I turned my back on Vaughan, a deliberate, deeply insulting gesture in their culture, and walked back up the steps. I didn't rush. I let the heavy thud of my boots fill the silence. When I reached the top, I turned to face the entire council. "The engine is seizing up," I said loudly, letting the words bounce around the vaulted ceiling. "There is too much friction, too much skimming, too much delay. I don't care about your politics. I don't care about your factions. I care about making this machine run the way it's supposed to." I locked eyes with an admiral sitting in the military tier, then a governor in the agrarian seats. The friction stops today. Anyone who throws a wrench in the gears from here on out deals with me. I sat down in the ornate chair beside Diana. The wood creaked under my weight. No one spoke. Vaughan was trembling on his grav sled, his extra arms wrapped defensively across his chest. The entire chamber was frozen, terrified, not by a display of superior firepower, but by the blunt, unyielding audacity of a human who simply refused to play their game. Diana didn't look at me, but underneath the voluminous folds of her crimson robe, I felt her cold, three-fingered hand reach out. She gripped my wrist, her claws digging slightly into my skin. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the desperate, grounding grip of someone who had just found a solid handhold in a hurricane. Royal armories always smell the same, regardless of the species that built them. It is a distinct, sharp cocktail of ionized air from charging power packs, the heavy musk of machine oil, and the cold metallic scent of waiting violence. I stood in the center of the High Prime's personal garrison, running a thumb over the matte black barrel of a Type 4 plasma carbine. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, perfectly balanced, but it was ruined by the heavy, gold-inlaid ceremonial casing bolted over the receiver. "Take it off," I said, dropping the rifle onto the metal inspection table. The sound echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. Commander Graves stared at me. He was a terrifying specimen, 8 feet of corded muscle and charcoal-grey scales belonging to a reptilian species that evolved on a high-gravity death world. His translated name sounded ridiculous coming out of his multi-hinged jaw, but I wasn't going to argue with a guy who could bite my head off like a cherry tomato. Sir Graves rumbled the subharmonics vibrating in my chest. "The casing bears the crest of the High Prime. It is required for the Praetorian Guard to display. It adds 4 pounds to the weapon's center of mass and restricts the heat venting." I interrupted, looking up to meet his slit-pupil gaze. "It makes the gun slower to track and faster to overheat. If we're standing around a throne looking pretty, keep the gold. If we're actually going to clear out the rot in the outer rim, I want your men moving fast and shooting straight. Strip the casings." Graves didn't blink. His massive chest rose and fell in a slow, deliberate breath. For a second, I thought I'd pushed too hard. I was a human mechanic, wearing borrowed clothes, barking orders at the most elite military unit in the sector. My palms were sweating. I wiped them discreetly on my trousers. Then Graves reached down, dug a single massive claw under the gold casing of the rifle, and snapped it off with a sharp crack of breaking composite. He tossed the crumpled gold into a nearby scrap bin. "Armorers!" Graves barked his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "Strip the ceremonial plating from all active duty weaponry. Replace with thermal dispersal shrouds." A chorus of affirmative grunts echoed through the armory as dozens of technicians scrambled to obey. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "You know your weapons, human," Graves said, narrowing his eyes at me. "I know machines," I corrected. "A gun is just an engine that throws metal instead of turning a drive shaft. It relies on efficiency, Right now, this whole station is running inefficiently. We're going to fix that. A soft scuffing sound drew my attention toward the heavy blast doors. Toby was standing there, half hidden, behind the thick steel frame. He wore a scaled-down version of his mother's diplomatic tunics, stark white and completely impractical. He looked incredibly small. I waved him over. He hesitated, his fractured quartz eyes darting toward Graves before he hurried across the polished floor, his boots barely making a sound. "You should be in your tutoring cycle." Graves noted, though his deep voice softened remarkably when addressing the boy. "History of the Concordat." Toby recited his tone flat. "It is entirely fictionalized. The tutor says the first era was built on mutual respect. Mother says it was built on orbital bombardments and blackmail." I snorted, pulling a stool out from under the inspection table. "Your mother has a solid grasp of political science. Have a seat, kid." Toby climbed onto the stool, his legs dangling halfway to the floor. He stared at the disassembled plasma carbine on the table, his three-fingered hands clasped tightly in his lap. He was vibrating with that same nervous energy he'd carried into my shop. "You threatened Minister Vaughan today," Toby said quietly. "The entire station is transmitting the audio logs. My tutor said you were a barbarian who would bring the council to ruin." "And what do you think?" I asked, picking up a sonic cleaner and running it over the exposed, cooling fins of the rifle. The high-pitched whine stripped away a layer of carbon buildup, revealing shining metal beneath. "I think Vaughan looked like a coward," Toby whispered, a tiny, fierce spark lighting up his eyes. "He was afraid of you. Fear isn't a long-term strategy, Toby," I said, setting the tool down. I leaned on the table, putting myself at his eye level. "Fear is a wrench. You use it to break a rusted bolt loose. But if you just keep hitting the engine with a wrench, you'll smash it to pieces. Eventually you have to actually fix the broken parts." I picked up the core magnet of the rifle. It was heavy and smelled sharply of ozone. I held it out to him. "Hold this." He blinked, surprised, but reached out and took it. His arms dropped slightly under the unexpected weight. "That's the heart of the weapon," I explained. "It aligns the plasma. If it's even a fraction of a millimeter out of place, the gun tears itself apart when you pull the trigger. Everything has to work together. Right now, your mother's council is a misaligned magnet. They're tearing the Empire apart from the inside. I didn't yell at Vaughan just to scare him. I yelled at him to see who else flinched." Toby looked down at the heavy metal cylinder in his hands, tracing the intricate milling lines with a clawed finger. "Did anyone flinch?" "Oh yeah," I said, a grim smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. Half the Admiralty board looked like they were going to vomit. We know exactly who Vaughan's friends are now. I gently took the core magnet back and slotted it into the receiver. It clicked into place with a satisfying, heavy sound. "Are you going to be my father now?" The question hit me harder than a physical blow. The absolute, unvarnished sincerity in his voice stripped away all my cynical armor in a fraction of a second. I looked at the kid. He wasn't asking for a political figurehead. He was asking for an anchor. He was asking for someone who wouldn't disappear in a rigged transport explosion. My throat felt tight. I swallowed hard, the taste of engine grease suddenly completely absent from my mouth, replaced by the terrifying, suffocating flavor of real responsibility. "I don't know the first thing about raising a prince," I told him, keeping my voice brutally honest. "I swear a lot. I drink terrible coffee. I solve most of my problems by hitting them with heavy objects." I reached out and awkwardly patted his shoulder. His scales felt warm and smooth under my calloused hand. "But I promise you this, Toby. Nobody is ever going to look at you like a piece on a chessboard again. Not while I'm breathing." Toby didn't smile. His species didn't really have the facial musculature for it, but the frantic, shallow breathing that usually plagued him seemed to slow down. He leaned into my hand, just a fraction of an inch. From the doorway I caught a flash of crimson silk. Diana was standing in the shadows watching us. When I met her eyes, she didn't look like a high prime. She looked like a mother who had just watched someone pull her drowning child out of the water. She pressed a hand to her chest, gave me a single slow nod, and slipped away into the quiet corridors of the spire. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The bed in my quarters was too large, the mattress filled with some kind of adaptive gel that kept trying to perfectly contour to my spine. I hated it. I missed my lumpy cot in the hangar. I ended up lying on the thick rug on the floor, staring up at the ambient glow of the ceiling panels, listening to the absolute unnatural silence of the upper levels. When the silence finally broke, it shattered. The klaxons weren't the polite chiming alerts of a diplomatic vessel. They were harsh, gut-vibrating sirens designed to wake people from deep cryogenic sleep. The red emergency lighting kicked on, bathing the room in the color of fresh blood. The sudden shift made my eyes water. I was on my feet and pulling on my boots before my conscious brain fully registered the noise. I grabbed the heavy hydro-spanner I'd smuggled from my toolbox, old habits die hard, and sprinted out into the corridor. The air was already changing. The sterile scent of white lotus was gone, replaced by the bitter, acrid sting of burning insulation and raw promethium fuel. That smell meant something big was on fire, and it wasn't supposed to be. I found Diana in the primary command nexus. She was standing over the holographic tactical table, her crimson robes thrown haphazardly over her shoulders. 3 Praetorians formed a tight, heavily armed wedge around her. Graves was barking orders into a wrist-mounted comms unit. "Status war," I demanded, shoving past a panicked communications officer. Diana looked up. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown completely open in the red emergency light. "Sector 7, the primary logistics bays. Multiple explosions in the atmospheric scrubbing manifolds. The scrubbers." I leaned over the table, staring at the flashing red icons clustering around the lower docks. My mechanical brain immediately started running the schematics. Why hit the scrubbers? They're redundant. If they go down the station, just vents atmospheric pressure and seals the bulkheads. "Look at the secondary targets," Graves rumbled, pointing a massive claw at the display. "Bulkhead control nodes. They are manually locking the heavy blast doors across the entire lower quadrant." A cold, heavy rock settled in my stomach. I knew exactly what was happening. It was a classic dirty dockworker strike tactic, weaponized on a massive scale. They aren't trying to suffocate the station, I said, my voice cutting through the panic in the room. They're trying to trap the fleet. Sector 7 controls the main launch tracks for the Royal Dreadnoughts. If those bulkheads lock down while the scrubbers are burning, the automated fire suppression systems will flood the hangars with hyper-dense chemical foam to stop the fire from reaching the munitions. Diana's face paled, the bruises under her eyes standing out starkly. The foam takes weeks to dissolve. The entire First Fleet would be grounded. "Exactly," I growled. "Vaughn isn't waiting for a council vote. He's neutralizing your military leverage right now. He's using mercenaries, calling them pirates, no doubt, to cripple your ships so you can't enforce the Perseus route." "Commander Graves." Diana snapped her voice, regaining its sharp, aristocratic edge. "Deploy the strike teams. Clear Sector 7. Negative high prime." Graves said, his jaw tight. "The lockdown has severed the primary transit elevators. My heavy infantry cannot reach the lower bays before the fire suppression systems trigger. We are locked out." "You're locked out of the front door," I corrected. I grabbed the edge of the holotable, dragging the map to focus on the labyrinthine maintenance shafts, crisscrossing the station's underbelly. I spent the last 3 years crawling through the guts of this station, fixing pipes your engineers were too lazy to touch. There's a secondary coolant exhaust vent that drops straight into the ceiling of Sector 7. It bypasses the bulkheads. Graves stared at me. That shaft is less than a meter wide. My men cannot fit. I looked down at my own frame. I was broad-shouldered for a human, but compared to the Praetorians, I was practically wire. I can, I said. I looked up at Graves. Give me a Type 4 carbine, 3 breaching charges, and your fastest comms unit. I'll drop in manually, override the fire suppression mainframe, and pop the bulkheads from the inside so your boys can sweep the trash. Absolutely not, Diana said instantly. She stepped around the table, putting herself between me and Graves. Her scales were flushed a dark, angry purple. You are the consort-elect. You are not a strike operative. I will not allow you to crawl into a burning sector filled with mercenaries. Diana, I said, keeping my voice low so the rest of the room couldn't hear. I reached out and gently gripped her shoulders. She was trembling violently. If that fleet gets foamed, you lose all your leverage. Vaughn wins. The Council will force you to abdicate by morning. I do not care about the throne, she hissed, her voice cracking. I care about Toby. And I care about... I cannot lose another anchor. The raw vulnerability in her eyes hit me harder than the klaxons. It wasn't political calculation. It was genuine, desperate fear. You're not going to lose me, I told her, my grip tightening slightly, offering her a solid point in a collapsing room. I'm a cockroach, remember? We survive everything. And I know these maintenance shafts better than the mercs know their own guns. I let go of her and turned to Graves. Get me the gear, Commander. The clock is ticking. 5 minutes later, I was standing over a rusted grate in a dark, humid service corridor 3 levels above the docks. The heavy plasma carbine was slung across my back, the cold metal biting into my spine. The air here was thick with the smell of burning plastic and raw fear. Graves handed me a compact breaching charge. You will have exactly 4 minutes before the thermal sensors trigger the foam cascade. If you do not bypass the mainframe by then, the foam will crush your lungs. Good to know, I muttered, sliding the charge into my webbing. I grabbed the heavy grate, ignoring the screech of protesting metal, and heaved it aside. A blast of hot, foul air rushed up from the darkness below. Dean! Diana's voice crackled over the comms earpiece, tight and strained. Please, be efficient. Always, I said. I didn't hesitate. I dropped feet first into the black throat of the ventilation shaft, the heavy steel-toed boots leading the way down into the fire. Gravity is a blunt instrument. Sliding down a vertical maintenance shaft designed for automated scrubber drones is less of a descent and more of a controlled fall. The metal walls were slick with years of accumulated condensation and patches of bioluminescent mold. I braced my boots against the sides, the rubber soles shrieking against the steel, desperately trying to break my momentum. My shoulder slammed into a protruding rivet, tearing through the fine fabric of my borrowed tunic and taking a shallow, burning bite out of my skin. I didn't have the breath to curse. The air down here was thick enough to chew, heavily laced with the chemical tang of melting polymer and the raw, suffocating heat of the primary thermal exhaust. A heavy iron grate rapidly approached in the darkness below me. I kicked out with both feet, putting my entire weight behind the heavy steel toes of my work boots. The rusted hinges gave way with a sickening crunch. The grate blew outward, and I tumbled out of the shaft into the stifling open air of Sector 7's upper gantry. I hit the grated floor hard, rolling to absorb the impact, but my knee slammed into a steel guardrail. Pain flared white-hot up my thigh. I bit down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, forcing the groan back down my throat. Below me, the massive logistics bay was a cathedral of shadows and flashing red emergency strobes. The royal dreadnoughts sat in their cradles, massive sleeping leviathans of dark metal. And clustered around the illuminated glass cylinder of the fire suppression mainframe were 3 figures. They weren't dock workers. They wore heavy, unmarked environmental suits and carried compact, brutal-looking scatter rifles. Mercenaries. One of them was kneeling by the mainframe's access panel, jamming a bulky, brutalist piece of hardware into the terminal. An encryption spike. He was physically overriding the system to lock the bulkheads. Dean. Graves's voice rumbled in my earpiece, broken by static. 2 minutes to thermal cascade. The ambient temperature in the bay is triggering the automated foam reserves. I see them, I whispered, pulling the Type 4 carbine off my back. My hands were shaking. I wasn't a soldier. I'd seen combat in the border campaigns, sure, but from the seat of a supply hauler, praying the armor plating held, while lasers chewed the hull. I took a deep breath, letting the smell of burning wiring ground me. A gun is just a tool. A firefight is just a chaotic equation. I leveled the barrel over the edge of the catwalk, aimed at the mercenary guarding the terminal, and squeezed the trigger. Without the heavy gold ceremonial plating, the carbine kicked like a mule. A blinding streak of blue plasma tore through the dim air and slammed into the mercenary's chest plate. The armor flashed ablative coating, vaporizing instantly, and the sheer kinetic force threw him backward into a stack of shipping crates. The bay erupted into chaos. The remaining 2 mercs spun, tracking the trajectory of my shot. They didn't shout. They were professionals. They just raised their scatter rifles and saturated the gantry with suppressing fire. Shrapnel and superheated slag tore into the railing inches from my face. I threw myself flat, the hot metal of the deck biting into my cheek, covering fire. I muttered to myself, dragging my body along the grating. I pulled the breaching charge from my webbing, keyed the detonator for 3 seconds, and blindly lobbed it over the edge. I covered my ears and opened my mouth to save my eardrums. The explosion shook the entire bay, a concussive shock wave that sent a rain of dust and loose bolts clattering to the floor. I didn't wait for the smoke to clear. I vaulted over the railing, dropping 15 feet down onto the top of a heavy cargo lifter, then slid down its hydraulic arm to the main floor. One merc was down, stunned by the blast. The other was already turning toward me, his visor cracked, but his rifle steady. I brought the carbine up, but he was faster. A blast of scattershot tore a trench through the heavy plating of the lifter I was hiding behind, showering my left arm in liquid heat. I grunted, dropping the carbine as my fingers went numb. The merc lunged, pulling a serrated combat knife. He was bigger than me, heavily armored, and moving with lethal intent. I fell back on pure, ugly instinct. I grabbed the heavy hydrospanner from my belt, 2 solid pounds of hardened Durasteel, and swung it like a baseball bat. The heavy wrench connected with the side of his helmet with a deafening crack. The visor shattered. He staggered, dropping the knife, but his momentum carried him forward, tackling me to the deck. We rolled in the grime and grease of the hangar floor. He was crushing my ribs, his hands scrambling for my throat. I could smell the stale sweat and synthetic stims radiating off him. I jammed the handle of the spanner under his chin, pushing up with everything I had, feeling the cartilage pop. I bucked my hips, throwing him to the side, and brought the spanner down one more time. He stopped moving. I lay there for a second, my chest heaving, staring at the flashing red lights. Dean Diana's voice tore through the comms. 30 seconds, get out of there, the foam is dropping. I scrambled to my feet, my left arm hanging uselessly at my side. The air in the bay was already changing, growing thick and chemical heavy, as the massive ceiling vents began to prime. I sprinted toward the glowing glass cylinder of the mainframe. The encryption spike was jammed deep into the primary port, a mess of spliced wires overriding the physical locks. I didn't have time to slice the code. I didn't have a datapad. "Sorry, Your Highness," I wheezed, "doing it my way." I grabbed the heavy metal body of the encryption spike with my good hand, braced my boot against the delicate glass housing of the mainframe, and ripped it backward. Sparks showered my face. The glass shattered, raining jagged shards over my shoulders. The terminal shrieked in alarm as raw, unshielded wires sparked against the exposed housing. 10 seconds! Graves roared over the comms. Above me, the massive nozzles began to hiss, spitting the first droplets of thick yellow chemical foam. I reached into the sparking mess of the terminal. It burned. The raw voltage tore through my fingertips, sending agonizing jolts up my arm, but I found the two thick, braided hard lines that controlled the manual bulkhead overrides. I grabbed them, clamped them together, and squeezed. The shock threw me backward. I hit the deck hard, my vision whiting out entirely. But through the ringing in my ears I heard it. The deep, heavy pneumatic groan of the primary blast doors sliding open. The chemical foam stopped spitting. The massive ceiling vents slammed shut with a heavy metallic finality. From the newly opened bulkheads, the rhythmic thud of Praetorian boots flooded the bay like an earthquake. I lay on my back, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. My left arm felt as if it were packed with crushed glass. My fingertips were completely blackened and numb from electrical burns. I took a ragged breath, choking on the brutally cold rush of ozone and smoke. A shadow fell over me. Commander Graves stood there, scanning the darkness beyond the cargo crates with his plasma rifle. He surveyed the shattered glass of the terminal and the unconscious mercenary bleeding out onto the deck. Graves reached down with one massive clawed hand. I grabbed his forearm with my good arm, and he hauled me up effortlessly. The bulkheads are open. The fleet is secure. Graves rumbled, his voice remarkably quiet. "You broke the proprietary lock. Reset the circuit," I coughed, spitting blood onto the grating. "Mechanic's privilege. Your boys got the rest. Perimeter secured. The saboteurs will be interrogated." Graves looked directly at me, his usual condescension replaced by clinical respect. "You bleed red human, but you do not break easily." "Too stubborn to die in a basement," I muttered. The walk back up to the spire was a blur of frantic security sweeps. A medic hit me with a dose of synthetic coagulant and wrapped my arm in a hissing compression sleeve that sent fresh agony shooting through my shoulder. I refused the stretcher. When the elevator hissed open to the primary command nexus, the room fell dead silent. I looked like hell-borrowed clothes, shredded, soaked in oil sweat, and my own blood favoring my right leg heavily. Diana's rigid aristocratic posture shattered. Ignoring protocol, she crossed the room in 3 long strides, her crimson robes billowing, and stopped inches from my chest. She lightly touched the soot-stained skin of my cheek with a trembling hand. The manufactured scent of white lotus was entirely gone from her, replaced by the heavy, radiant warmth of overwhelming relief. "You are an idiot," she whispered. "I told you." I managed an exhausted, crooked smile. Cockroaches. We survive. Toby broke past the heavily armed guards, burying his face in my ruined jacket. He clutched me so tightly, his claws dug through the fabric. Hissing in pain, I wrapped my good arm around his narrow shoulders. "I brought you something," I told him gently. I dug out the burnt metal casing of the encryption spike and pressed it into his hands. Proof of concept. The engine is running again. Toby stared at the twisted metal, his fractured quartz eyes wide, then buried his face back into my side. "High prime." A comms officer called out, breaking the quiet. "Incoming priority transmission. Minister Vaughan." Diana stiffened. Her eyes hardened to orbital ice as she seamlessly donned the mask of an absolute monarch. But she didn't step away. She stood shoulder to shoulder with me, a silent, undeniable wall of support. "Main screen," she ordered. Minister Vaughan appeared on the massive display, lounging on his grav sled with a smug, oily smile. He held a crystal glass, clearly expecting to see a room descending into panic. "High Prime." Vaughan purred, feigning deep concern. "I received alerts of a fire in Sector 7. I pray the fleet wasn't caught behind the bulkheads." Diana didn't answer. She just looked at me. I stepped forward, dominating the holocam's view. Bruised, bleeding, and covered in underbelly grease, I cradled my injured arm against my chest. Vaughan's smug smile faltered. His primary eyes widened, dropping to the dark blood, dripping from my fingers onto the pristine steel floor. "Vaughan!" I rasped my voice, grinding like gravel. "Human!" Vaughan stammered. "What is this? Where is the panic?" "The bulkheads are open," I interrupted. "Your mercenaries are bleeding out in holding cells. Your encryption spike is a paperweight. The fleet launches in 20 minutes to blockade your private shipping lanes." Vaughan gripped the edges of his grave sled collar, draining from his slug-like skin. "You cannot prove anything. Those were pirates. I have a plasma carbine of very bad attitude, and the absolute authority of the High Prime," I said quietly. The promise of violence hung heavy in the sterile air. "I warned you about throwing wrenches into my engine. I just crawled through fire to pull your wrench out." I stared into his terrified eyes. "Pack your things, Minister. Tomorrow I'm cleaning house, and I'm bringing the big tools." I slapped the console. The screen went black. The command center was utterly silent. The officers, the Praetorians, even Graves, stared at me with unvarnished respect. I turned back to Diana. A fierce, predatory pride glowed in her fractured quartz eyes. I offered her a tired smile as my knees finally buckled under the adrenaline crash. "So," I breathed, swaying slightly, "do I get to sleep in a real bed tonight? Or is the galaxy still broken? Waking up in a High Prime's personal medical suite is an exercise in profound disorientation. There were no harsh fluorescent lights humming in the ceiling, no sharp smell of antiseptic, and none of the background vibrations that usually told me a station's life support systems were keeping me breathing. It was just quiet. A heavy, expensive silence. I groaned, trying to shift my weight on a mattress that felt like it was made of suspended water. The alien painkillers they had pumped into my system made my blood feel like warm molasses. My mouth tasted like aluminum foil. I looked down at my left arm. It was encased from shoulder to wrist in a hard, translucent resin that emitted a faint, rhythmic pulse, knitting the muscle and bone back together at a cellular level. "You should not move," a quiet voice said from the corner of the room. I turned my head. The movement sent a dull throb through my neck, but the painkillers blunted the worst of it. Toby was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair that swallowed his small frame completely. He was wearing normal clothes, a simple dark tunic and trousers instead of the ridiculous diplomatic whites. A datapad rested in his lap, its blue light casting sharp shadows over his plum-colored scales. "I've been lying here long enough to grow moss, kid," I rasped. My voice sounded terrible, stripped raw by the smoke in the hangar. I swallowed hard, trying to generate some saliva. "How long was I out?" 32 planetary hours, Toby replied, hopping down from the chair. He walked over to the side of the bed, his boots completely silent on the thick carpet. "The medical droids had to reconstruct the dermis on your hand. You suffered severe electrical burns, and 3 fractured ribs, and minor smoke inhalation. Sounds like a standard Tuesday on the dry docks, I muttered. Toby didn't laugh, but the frantic, shallow breathing that usually accompanied his anxiety was entirely gone. He stood close to the bed, looking at the hardened resin on my arm. He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before resting his 3-fingered hand gently against the cast. "Minister Vaughan was arrested," Toby said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Commander Graves dragged him out of his estate. He was screaming. The entire council watched on the primary feed." "Good," I said, letting my head sink back into the pillow. "Let them watch. It sets a precedent." The soft hum of the doors parting drew my attention. Diana walked into the room. She looked different. The exhausting, bruised tension that had been wrapped around her throat since the moment I met her was gone. She wasn't wearing the heavy crimson robes of the monarch, nor the stiff ceremonial silks. She wore a simple, loose-fitting grey sweater and dark slacks. She looked intensely, beautifully normal. In her hands, she carried a battered, insulated steel mug. "The medical droids advised against giving you stimulants," Diana said, walking to the edge of the bed. Her voice was warm, completely devoid of the sharp edges of diplomacy. "But I had the kitchen staff synthesize something based on your ship's registry logs. They called it a dark roast." She held the mug out. My right arm worked fine, so I pushed myself up into a sitting position, gritting my teeth against the protest of my ribs, and took it. The metal was blessedly hot. I took a sip. It was bitter, slightly burnt, and tasted aggressively like dirt. "It's perfect," I groaned, closing my eyes and letting the caffeine hit my system. Diana sat down on the edge of the mattress. The bed shifted slightly under her weight. She looked at me, really looked at me, her fractured quartz eyes, tracing the soot stains the medical droids hadn't managed to scrub from my hairline, down to the heavy cast on my arm. "The Perseus trade routes are fully operational," she said quietly. "The automated bulkheads in Sector 7 are being repaired, and the Council passed my agricultural budget this morning without a single objection." "Funny how agreeable people get when you threaten to smash their toys," I said, taking another long drink of the terrible coffee. "They are terrified of you," she corrected, a faint, genuine smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "The official registry lists you as a highly volatile apex predator. Rumors are circulating that humans consume raw meat and settle disputes through gladiatorial combat." I snorted, almost choking on the coffee. "Let them think it. It keeps the friction down. But if I'm staying, we need to set a few ground rules." Diana's smile faded slightly, replaced by a quiet, serious attention. "Name them." "First, I am not wearing that ridiculous gold-trimmed cape. Ever." Toby let out a sound that was remarkably close to a giggle. Diana nodded slowly. "Acceptable." "Second," I continued, resting the mug on my knee, "I need a workspace. I can't sit in velvet chairs all day listening to politicians argue over tariffs. Give me a bay in the lower hangars. I'll maintain the Praetorian transports. If I don't have grease on my hands, I'm going to lose my mind." "I will have the tertiary bay cleared and assigned to you by tomorrow," Diana promised. "And third," I said, my voice softening. I looked at Toby, who was still standing by the bed, his hand resting on my cast. Then I looked at Diana. The distance between us, the galaxy of politics and protocol, felt suddenly very small. No more solitary confinement at the top of the spire. You two are a family. Now I'm part of it. If the engine starts making a weird noise, you don't hide it. You bring it to me. We fix it together." Diana's breath hitched. She looked down at her hands, the silver scales on her knuckles catching the dim light of the room. When she looked back up, Her eyes were bright, stripped of all the armor she had worn for years. She reached out and placed her hand over mine, her cool, smooth fingers contrasting sharply with my rough calluses. Together. She repeated the word, carrying the heavy, solid weight of a vow. I leaned back against the pillows, the bitter taste of coffee in my mouth, the dull ache in my ribs, and the heavy, undeniable reality of a bruised alien queen holding my hand. I was a grease monkey from a backwater orbital station. I had no business running an empire. But as I looked at the kid standing by my side, and the woman who had finally stopped drowning, I realized I didn't care. The galaxy was a rusted seizing machine, full of corrupt politicians and broken gears. It was going to take a lot of heavy tools to fix it. Good thing I brought my own. That brings us to the end of Dean's brutal, grease-stained journey from a cynical mechanic to the terrifying right hand of an alien empire. Sometimes the galaxy doesn't need a polished diplomat. It just needs a stubborn human with a heavy wrench and a refusal to back down. If you enjoyed watching Dean tear through the corrupt politics of the High Council and step up to protect his new family, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and subscribe to the channel for more grounded, heavy-hitting HFY stories.